Everyone thinks spiritual retreats are about enlightenment. They're wrong. In the 1980s, a man named Michel Rostand, though he'd eventually rebrand himself as Jabalance, began gathering followers in Los Angeles under the guise of a meditation and consciousness movement. What started as weekly gatherings in rented spaces would evolve into something far darker, a decades-long operation of psychological manipulation, financial exploitation, and emotional enslavement. I've read the testimonies myself. The accounts are harrowing precisely because they are mundane at first. The movement called itself Buddhafield, a name borrowed from Buddhist philosophy, though twisted beyond recognition. Rostand positioned himself as an enlightened guide, someone who transcended ordinary consciousness and could shepherd others toward spiritual awakening. Members didn't know, as they handed over their savings and isolation intensified, that they were entering a trap designed by someone with no spiritual credentials whatsoever. By the early 1990s, Buddhafield had relocated to a compound in the Mojave Desert. Followers, numbering in the dozens by then, lived communally, worked without pay, and surrendered decision-making to Rostand entirely. What made this cult distinct wasn't violence or overt coercion. It was subtler, psychological control masquerading as spiritual practice. Rostand employed what researchers would later identify as classic cult tactics: sleep deprivation through marathon meditation sessions, isolation from family members, constant criticism framed as spiritual feedback, and a hierarchy that elevated his word above all else. Members were told their doubts were ego, their exhaustion was spiritual purification, their financial ruin was detachment from material illusion. The financial mechanism was elegant in its cruelty. Members were encouraged, then demanded to contribute their income, inheritance, or savings to the group's spiritual mission. Rostand lived luxuriously while his followers subsisted on minimal food. He drove expensive cars. They walked. He made all decisions. They obeyed. What made escape nearly impossible was the psychological architecture. Rostand had convinced followers that the outside world was spiritually toxic, that their families didn't understand them, that leaving would result in spiritual collapse or cosmic punishment. One member I read about described it as living inside a thought cage. The bars were invisible, but they held. Around 1994, something shifted. A handful of members, exhausted, financially depleted, and beginning to see the machinery of manipulation, started asking questions. They didn't know yet that their departure would trigger Rostand's paranoia and accelerate the group's fragmentation. By 1995, the first defectors had left and begun speaking to journalists and cult experts. Their testimonies were consistent. Rostand had systematized control through a combination of spiritual language, psychological pressure, and economic dependency. He'd created a closed loop where questioning him was itself evidence of spiritual failure. The group eventually dissolved, though not cleanly. Some members remained loyal to Rostand even after leaving. Others required years of deprogramming to rebuild their sense of self. The financial and emotional damage persisted long after the compound was abandoned. Several former members have spoken publicly about the lasting trauma, trust issues, financial ruin, estrangement from family. What's particularly instructive about Buddhafield is how it reveals the vulnerability of intelligent, educated people to manipulation. These weren't naive recruits. Many were professionals, teachers, artists, engineers. They were drawn to genuine spiritual seeking. Rostand simply exploited that sincerity. The mechanics of control he used, isolation, sleep deprivation, financial entanglement, spiritual authority, have appeared in cults for decades. But Rostand's particular genius was making followers believe they were experiencing enlightenment while he systematically dismantled their autonomy. The paradise he promised was, from the beginning, a mirage. Today, former Buddhafield members have become advocates for cult awareness and recovery. Their willingness to speak publicly has helped others recognize similar patterns in groups they're involved with. Some have written detailed accounts. Others work with deprogramming organizations. Their voices matter because they've lived what most of us only read about. The Buddhafield case didn't end in mass tragedy like Jonestown or Heaven's Gate. There were no bodies, no poisoned drinks. But it was a tragedy nonetheless, a slow, methodical erosion of dozens of people's lives, their finances, their relationships, their sense of reality. Sometimes the most devastating cults are the ones that operate quietly, in plain sight, wrapped in the language of spirituality. If you want to understand the psychological patterns that define these movements before they consume someone you know, subscribe. We decode the machinery of control every week.